Thank you for that nice introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. There's lots of seats up front, and I can't see any faces, so I won't make faces at you, and if you make faces at me, I won't be able to see them anyway. So, let's talk about regulation, and if there are any different, interesting, considerations for the development of substantial evidence of effectiveness in a rare disease. You all know this as well as I do, but just to put us in context, FDA is well known as a regulatory agency, but it has not always had quite so many regulations as it does today. It got into regulations usually because of disasters. So in 1938, sulfanilamide, someone had the brilliant idea to dissolve it in what is essentially antifreeze, give it to children, tasted sweet, they lost their kidneys and they died. Not a good thing to happen. And the first issues of safety were put into law for what was already the FDA. Then in 1962, there was a development of a product called thalidomide in Europe, and a number of children were born with foreshortened arms and legs. That product never was approved in the United States, but it gave rise to the Kefauver-Harris amendments, which looked further at safety and also efficacy of a product for its use in that condition. That also, in its own strange way, gave rise to the Orphan Drug Act, because with the imposition of those regulations, the cost of drug development began to go up and up and up, and drugs for rare diseases were simply not developed. Then one began to realize that, once these drugs are approved, we're not paying a whole lot of attention to them. Maybe we should. We were beginning to see some safety signals that would occur way down the road. And so in 1987, were the first post-marketing requirements, which was in PDUFA 1, I think. Following that, then in 2007, we had REMS passed, which have the much stricter post-marketing controls for safety and efficacy. But safety and efficacy is the real term that you want to use, and it's a balancing act. And different degrees of safety signals will be tolerated for very severe diseases than might be tolerated for some little ache or pain in the shoulder that you would like to have treated. Because you certainly don't want to die from a drug for a disease or an issue which was never going to hurt you long term in the first place. You can see that. What are the paths to drug development? What are some of the issues that we're looking at? How do we measure risk-benefit? What sorts of things are being considered today by today's FDA and by you as the regulated industry? Well, first one would like to know what is the disease, and you say, yeah, dummy, I'm developing a drug. I should know what the disease is. Trust me. Not all companies know for what disease they are developing a drug. They are sometimes having a drug and then looking for a disease. Better to have your disease first. And also know something about the natural history of your disease. And I say that because particularly for rare diseases, for orphan diseases, the real natural history of the disease has never been studied. It is very rare. The patients don't all live in one city. There aren't significant experts in every location. It waxes and wanes. It has varying progression. One needs natural history. And for patient groups, they are the best people to do natural history studies and registries. Catalog that disease. Know what happens to patients. Follow patients. Establish parameters that you will follow. Terribly, terribly important when you are studying a drug that will have, hopefully, a benefit effect on a particular disease. Is the disease life-altering or life-shortening? Many of the rare diseases with which we all deal are indeed serious and life-threatening diseases, something that was not really well understood at all in 1983 when the Orphan Drug Act was signed into law. But certainly the seriousness of the disease is taken into account at any time when you are developing a drug for a disease. And then how fast should you expect to see an effect of your drug on that particular disease? And what kind of effect are you expecting to see? Is your drug monogenic, or is it a heterogeneous disease? If you're going to begin to do gene therapy, and we're really right on the cusp of that, and I've talked to a tremendous number of people today at this meeting and in prior meetings. Europe has one approved gene therapy for a very, very, very rare disorder. I think 27 patients in the EU. We don't have any yet here in the US, but we're not too far away. It's going to come down the pike. If you have a heterogeneous disease, you can't treat it with a single gene. You're going to have to identify what genes are indeed involved and how best to treat those patients. Is there a support group for the disease? Support groups are very, very important. FDA is listening to them more and more. What is the interest of this support group? Sometimes we see that endpoints are determined for therapy, and that's not at all what the patients are interested in. Talk to them. What is bothering them? And will your particular therapy affect that aspect of the disease? Do we know how the drug works? What's the mechanism of action? Again, seems like that ought to be self-evident, but it may not always be. And you need to know how your drug works. What animal studies have already been done? What is FDA going to require? And for heaven's sakes, talk to the FDA and ask them. And is this drug already approved for another use? Are you going to repurpose the drug? And if you repurpose it, what kinds of IP do you have? Is there any way that you can protect your drug so that every Tom, Dick, Harry, and Josephine are going to be making it down the road, and you will lose an awful lot of your investment? Whoops, I went the wrong direction. We've talked a lot yesterday and today about proactive involvement of patients and advocates. FDA is very, very interested in what patients think these days. The FDASIA, the PDUFA 5 that was passed in 2012, specifically mandated that patients are a part of the approval process. Don't forget it. FDA will listen to them, and you should listen to patients too. They know their disease better than anyone else that has that disease. And throughout these slides, you're going to see that, I've got listened to the patients, talked to the patients many, many times because it is extraordinarily important. What are the ongoing activities between FDA and patient groups? Is Pat Furlong here, or did she go home? Pat is the executive director of Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, a group that has been very concerned with the development of drugs for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and among the things that PPMD has been tasked with doing has been to develop guidance for FDA's review on what endpoints ought to be in muscular dystrophy. Is the 6-minute walk test the only endpoint that is acceptable? What about for young men that can no longer walk? What is appropriate? What can be looked at? What about placebo-controlled trials? What do we know about natural history? But here again, FDA has tasked PPMD to do this. This is something that would not have happened several years ago. This is a new entree for FDA. Will they accept everything that PPMD suggests? Probably not. But there will be good back and forth discussion so that FDA understands where patients are coming from, and so that patient groups will understand where FDA is coming from. Because patient groups want a cure, a therapy, relief from their disease. FDA's raison d'etre is to assure that the drug is safe and effective for its intended use. They're not always the same. Although they certainly ought to be tightly intertwined. And, there is increasing transparency in the FDA and with industry and with patient groups. We're beginning to understand that we should not be either afraid or distrustful of each other, but work together for a common good. There is a new group on the horizon. And in full disclosure, I sit on the board of that group. That's the Biopontis Foundation. There are other similar models that are out there. But the idea is that in the process of drug development, there is, I'm sure everybody has heard this, the valley of death, that point from which you've got some preliminary preclinical data, information, hypothesis. You want to get further down the road and be able to get to patients, but until you get to patients, you can't raise money, and you can't get to patients unless you already have money. And so it's quite a catch-22. Biopontis Foundation, which is a not-for-profit, is looking at ways to better cross that divide of the valley of death, and figuring out ways, particularly for small companies, to be able to find ways to develop drugs in that death space, and to be able to fund that. It's just about to get up and running. Got lots of universities that have signed on, and other groups that are very excited about the kinds of things that they are doing and will be able to do in the future. Clinical trials. I listen to people saying, well, I don't want a placebo. And I must admit, I said that myself on one occasion. But that's because patients always think that the drug works. But the reason for a placebo-controlled trial is that the drug doesn't always work. And the best way to find that out is via a placebo-controlled clinical trial. Is it always feasible? No. Is it always ethical? No. But if at all possible, placebo-controlled trials are the fastest way to get an answer as to whether a product is or is not efficacious. Build a follow-on with the active drug, if indeed that is appropriate and you have good positive results from your drug. Don't leave your patients hanging. They finished the trial, they did beautifully, but that was the end of the trial, and we'll let you know when and if the drug was approved. No, build in a compassionate use, treatment IND, whatever term best fits your methodology, so that assuming the drug works, your patients can continue to receive that drug. In part of working with the patient community, don't forget that patients know where other patients are. They are connected. They are connected via the internet. They are connected via the telephone. They are connected via the executive director of the patient group. They can be a major help to you in finding patients. And my experience is that you think you have a lot of patients. You've got all these doctors lined up. They're all ready to give your drug. And then the day the trial opens, all the patients vanish. They don't meet the criteria. They've moved to another part of the world and you don't know where to find them. Patient groups can find each other and they're very valuable. With small patient populations, you have to be very, very careful in the design of your trials. And when I'm talking about small populations, we're talking about populations in the U.S. of 100, 200, even 5,000. That's very hard to find, and you have to design those trials very carefully because you don't get a chance to, we'll do another trial. You have neither the opportunity with patients, nor do you have the money to pursue that kind of activity. You will be doing multi-country, multi-centered clinical trials. Be prepared for it. It will happen, and it should happen. You really do want to be sure that the disease as diagnosed is the same disease in other places and that your drug works the same way in other places, and that FDA will acknowledge that it's the same disease. Endpoint and biomarker development. We hear a lot about that today. You need to have constructive plans and plan ahead for endpoints and biomarkers and make sure they're viable, usable, demonstrable, and measurable. Again, involve your patients. They know their disease. Expect to have long-term follow-up. That's going to happen in most clinical trials today, and certainly in a clinical trial for a rare disease. We've already mentioned FDA becoming more involved in interactive, and you may or may not have surrogate endpoints, and you want to know beforehand whether those surrogates are accepted by FDA and whether they're measurable endpoints. Your goal is an effective product as quickly as possible. Many orphan drugs do qualify for breakthrough therapy. There's a number of folks here I know that are in the process of developing drugs that have received breakthrough designation, which usually makes it faster and easier to work with FDA and to get answers back, and gives you the opportunity for continual dialogue with FDA. And you will obviously be closely monitoring your trials. Orphan drugs must be as safe and as effective for rare diseases as are drugs that are not orphan drugs. Patients with rare diseases deserve the same degree of efficacy. They do not want to be experiments. They want to know that their disease will be treated as well as it can be. and you may have unknown subgroups that come out of that, and you just need to be aware of everything that is going on. I'm getting the high sign here, and that was just at the right minute. I think we've run out of time. I'm going to be yanked off the stage, but I'm going to be sitting here in the audience, and if you need to find me, you can do that here, and my contacts are right here on the slide. Thank you very much.